Well, talking of Myanmar, Nazi ideology and Islamophobia are being systematically used to stoke hatred against more than 1 million Rohingyas in the western Rakhine state that is effectively destroying them as a people. Now, this is contained in a collaborative UK report based on research from Queen Mary University of London, which found systematic human rights violations, including sporadic massacres, torture, rape and forced labour that continue to occur. The findings come a week ahead of the national elections, in which the 1 million Rohingyas won't even have a say in the outcome. One of the authors of that study joins me now live from London, Thomas McManus. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
These are very disturbing findings, and we'll go through some of the issues step by step. But what you're really saying is that this is becoming a virtual genocide of the Rohingyas.
Yes, that's right. Our report reveals the way we analysed the situation on the ground based on months of interviews inside Rakhine State, that there is a genocidal process going on. We used a framework which, when genocides of the past have been analysed together, and we used a framework which has a periodization, so we talk about the stages of genocide, and we match those with the situation on the ground in Rakhine State. And if you'll allow me, I'll just take you through those stages quite quickly.
Please do.
The first stage is stigmatization. Stigmatization is when you find a group and you identify them as outsiders, and you start to dehumanize that group. So the Rohingya Muslims, 1.2 million of them in Rakhine State, you're not even allowed to use the word Rohingya inside Burma. I mean, we couldn't use it on the street in case someone overheard us. The government refers to them as illegal Bengalis, and this is a way of labeling them as outsiders, making it easy for people to treat them outside their what we call sphere of obligation. The next stage is harassment and terror, and this is when the verbal violence turns to actual physical violence. And in June 2012, we had what the government called communal violence between the Rohingya Muslims and the Rakhine Buddhists. But we found in our report that this was not spontaneous communal violence. This was highly organized. Villages around Sittwe received letters days before the violence was to start, informing them that they needed to have people ready for buses to pick them up and bring them down to Sittwe. So hundreds, if not large number of hundreds of people were brought down into Sittwe. 2 Rohingya villages were burnt to the ground, and Rohingya people were filtered into a large camp complex, and 140,000 have been living in that camp complex for the last 3 years. The next stage is isolation, and that's where the camp complex comes in. You're not allowed to leave. There are detention camps in effect. Outside of Sittwe in northern Rakhine State, we were not allowed to go, but we hear reports that Rohingya do not have freedom of movement, that they are isolated. The next stage is systematic weakening. Once the group is isolated, you remove healthcare, which has been done. Médecins Sans Frontières have been unceremoniously kicked out of Rakhine State. Rohingya are not allowed to be educated. It's very difficult for them to get to the hospitals. They're not allowed to politically organise. As you mentioned in your introduction, they've been disenfranchised. They cannot vote in the upcoming elections. And this creates a kind of a sick community. They're not allowed to progress. They don't see a future for themselves. That's where we are now in Rakhine State, in this systematic weakening phase. And the next phase is annihilation, and that's why we have grave concerns.
And there are pockets of, as you say, there's violence, these massacres. Explain to me why the Buddhist monks are, in a way, being used in this way, or allowing themselves to be used, because I'd imagine that they would have some status in the community.
Absolutely. The Sangha, the monkhood, if you will, are hugely revered, and anything they say actually goes. You know, people will listen to them and will follow them. And a small section of the Sangha have created a group called Mabatha, and they are campaigning around the country with anti-Muslim rhetoric, hate speech, if you will. And people are following them closely. And the government is also pandering to the Mabatha and other groups that are spreading hate speech, and recently have passed laws which have put restrictions on marriage between religions and the number of births that Muslims can have. This is seen as the effect of these new laws that have come in. So there may be a power struggle between the Sangha and the government that is feeding into this persecution of the Rohingya.
And also, as on top of the anti-Muslim propaganda, there's also Nazi paraphernalia that you uncovered as well.
Yeah, in Burma you do see Nazi paraphernalia on the streets. You see people with T-shirts that might have Hitler on them, or SS helmets for motorcycle helmets. And there's a background of this all over the country. Whether people are aware of the connotations or not is another question that we weren't able to answer. But based on top of this background, we did find that the local Arakan National Party, who are the nationalist party in Rakhine State, use phrases like defend the fatherland. They talk about while Hitler and Himmler may have been enemies of the Jews, they were most likely heroes to the German people. And they talk about defense of the bloodlines and things like that, which could be inferred to come from Nazi ideology.
Thomas, if the government loses powers, may be expected, or loses the elections, what chance do you think Aung San Suu Kyi might be more sympathetic, or any government that she's able to form?
Well, if we start with the local state government first, the Rohingya, who make up 40% of Rakhine State, they can't vote. So the Arakan National Party are set to win local elections in the state, and they will put in a state minister, presumably, once they have done so. Aung San Suu Kyi's party don't have a foothold in Rakhine State. They told us it was unlikely they would run any candidates, and they certainly didn't have the resources to run any campaigns. So that's in Rakhine State. In Burma, Myanmar as a whole, Aung San Suu Kyi's party are expected to do very well. Whether that'll give her the freedom to start talking about the Rohingya issue remains to be seen. But her silence on the issue so far has gone from disappointment when we first observed her not saying anything about this issue, has gone from disappointment to a kind of a real suspicion of complicity in the treatment of the Rohingya. One would expect a moral leader of Aung San Suu Kyi's stature to have spoken out about this issue a long time ago. Yep. And there are serious questions now as to why she hasn't.
Very disturbing stuff, Thomas. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.